Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who view their lives as just one cataclysm after another, just destroying everything. Each week we spin the wheel and land on a new genre. Spies, mysteries, horror, romance, SF. It's all on the shelf. And right now we're reading fantasy books. This time, Robert E. Howard's The Hyborian Age. I'm Zach, and this week this is a tough one to wrap the brain around, but I'm really interested in just the broad strokes view of history that Howard is presenting here.
I'm Bob. I'm interested in the comparison between this and what Tolkien talks about when he says he's making a sub-creation. What are the things that are similar? What are the things that are different? But yeah, it is a little bit hard to wrap your head around. There is a lot of cataclysms, as you said. Well, there's two main ones, I guess. But we have, I think, Zach, three main ages where we have happening way before Conan, where we have, I think, King Thule, and that's in the Thurian age, if I'm saying that right. Then with Conan, we're in the Hyborian age, and then we have our own modern age. And there's a through line, however, in those cataclysms, people mostly forget. There are a few beings who have the history in their brain, but most regular people, they don't remember where they're from.
Yeah, and I think what Howard is really doing here is giving us this broad overview that really doesn't do much in way of character as much as it does in way of like people, or what you would call like races, where it's like there's these people and there's that people and they moved here and they fought them, but we don't really get any actual characters until, gosh, well into like maybe 3/4 of the way through this short piece. The story of Eris and Gorm. Eris being a Numidian priest who basically attempts to civilize the Picts by teaching them, agriculture, metallurgy, and just like, cultural values. You get the sense that he's kind of like a remnant of a much older civilization. He's coming down from the mountains, so to speak, to try to share some knowledge with this more warlike people, who is ultimately represented by Gorm. But what Gorm does is, well, he takes the technology, but leaves behind the morality and the values, thus creating a kind of, I guess you could say cavemen with guns kind of a situation, savages with better and better weapons.
There's a great quote in there where it says, so Eris is a Numidian priest, and he's preaching about Mitra, which is almost like a Christian god. I mean, Mitra believes in forgiveness, lots of Western Christian-like beliefs. But there's this great quote that says, Eris was the highest product of an innately artistic race refined by centuries of civilization. Gorm had behind him a heritage of 100,000 years of screaming savagery. So Gorm and the Picts, they take all these lessons, but you're right, it is just like giving cavemen guns, because they take farming, they take a few things, but mostly they're like, oh, technology. Oh, we could make really great weapons. They cause a huge problem just because of this priest coming down from the mountain.
I'm kind of interested in how Robert Howard basically says that he has real pragmatic motivations for writing this. So there's kind of an opening paragraph from Howard. It seems to have been written after. Like it's kind of like an afterthought, or like him returning back to this essay after some time. Because what he says is that he wrote the Hyborian Age as a kind of blueprint, as a kind of map for the world that he wants to set Conan in. And he says that really everything he's written in the kind of Conan verse has abided by this blueprint that he set down beforehand. But what he says here, I think is really interesting. He says, I found that by adhering to the facts and spirit of that history in writing the stories, it was easier to visualize and therefore to present him as a real flesh and blood character rather than a ready-made product. And that's really interesting to me, actually. Just kind of this pragmatic approach. do you like it? I guess that's really what I want to ask you. Do you like it when authors like sit down and really world build everything out?
That is a very good question. I am really interested when Howard is doing it, and I'm really interested when Tolkien is doing it. And I'm not as interested, I just have a bias for modern fantasy authors. There's something more interesting, maybe because they're two of the first people who really commit to it, I feel like Tolkien and Howard. But I feel like now, I don't know, it feels almost hokey. Well, no, that's not true. I guess George R.R. Martin, when I read that, I feel like, wow, thank God he did that. That's such a cool world that he's built. But there's a few others that I'm not going to say, but that I'm thinking about, and I just feel like they really half-assed it. Howard's essay is really short, but I think it's so interesting that he is saying, I'm doing this to serve the character. You know, I want to make this flesh and blood Conan feel realistic. And he said, I can't remember who he told this to, maybe Lovecraft, but he said when he's writing Conan stories, he feels like Conan is standing behind him with the axe right above his head. So if he gets it wrong, he's going to split his skull in two. So he's really committed to this.
Like a Socrates demon whispering in his ear every time he does something wrong.
Yes.
Yeah. So like to rewind just a second, there are times where I also bristle against this kind of like pre-world building. But honestly, it's not when I like when I read that Robert Jordan has, you know, his own private notes for Wheel of Time that are like, you know, longer than any of the books or like a couple books put together. That's for some reason that's like fine to me, just so long as I don't have to like read it or I'm not expected to read it. But when I look at writing materials or like resources that are often given to authors and they give you kind of like these, there's no real better way to put it other than like spreadsheets, character traits, history, fears, eye color, you know, things like that. Like you're building out like a D&D campaign or like building a character in an RPG. I don't know why, but something about the kind of like industrialized process of character building and world building that you see in really contemporary genre fiction just bristles me in the wrong way. But I think that this escapes that because it doesn't feel manufactured, if that makes sense. It feels like he sat down and kind of stream of consciousness, you know, maybe after a couple drafts, but a history. And yeah, I don't know. Does that ring true with your experience of it, or?
I guess I think my bone to pick, I was thinking more about, I really loved how you said the industrialization of that process, or the industry kind of turning it into graphic organizers so you can organize it and it's all pre-made for you. Now there are, I mean, these are great, especially if you're running a campaign like an RPG campaign. You might want to use a computer program that allows you to manage everything. But yeah, it does feel hokey in writing now. I think the big part of it is, though, again, I'm not going to say who, but a few authors writing today, I don't think they really put as much energy into the actual writing. You know, they spend a lot of time making a world, and then they write a book that's like, But then you have Martin and you have Tolkien and you have Howard. And I think, I want to talk about this later too, but Howard is an absolute master, a master of sentences. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. And I think people just like to think that he wrote really badass stuff. You know, I love this character who can smash heads. He is an extremely, extremely, extremely gifted writer. And if someone disagrees, I hope they can teach me why. I think he's excellent. But I think that is where the other stuff feels hokey, where you don't actually write something good. You just world build for almost no reason. Howard is writing masterful prose and creating this. And he might say that this essay is a little bit boring, because it is kind of boring. But he's like, I need to write it, otherwise it's not going to be clear to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing, is that this doesn't feel like an essay that's meant to be read, if that makes sense. Like there's writing that's meant to be read, which I would classify everything else he wrote as writing that's meant to be read, like eminently readable, lush, gorgeous sentences that are just dripping with action and emotion. Oh, I love them. But this is like a peek behind the scenes. And yes, it was published. I don't know the history of its publication, but it was like clearly published and it's clearly included in everything else. So clearly some Howard scholars, I guess, I presume there are Howard scholars, whoever's editing these books together views this as important. However, a question that's been on my mind, and you might have a different view of this, is whether I actually, like, having read it and then afterwards reading Conan, did I need to read this? And I'm not saying, am I better off for having read it? I'm saying, was it necessary for me to read it? Absolutely necessary. To which I will answer, no.
Yeah, I think you're right. You get kind of a snapshot of the main meaning of this essay in different stories. For example, we're going to talk later about the Tower of the Elephant, where that creature has seen all of this happen. So he kind of really quickly summarizes all of these changes. And I think one of the most important changes that happens is not just, no, it is just, never mind. It's losing civilization. I think that is very different from Tolkien, and that's what I want to talk about next. But I think the idea of like savage, without civilization and almost kind of just the most basic possible language, kind of hunter-gatherer and shamanism. Just, I think the Picts would be qualified as this at one point, where they are not, they're barely clans, I guess. And then you go to a barbarian society where it is more clans, where you have the Hyborian people who become the Hyperboreans making these clans. They're barbarians like Conan. Then later you have civilization. And I think this is so different from Tolkien because it seems like, especially from the Thurian age to the Hyborian age, the Thurians were in high civilization. Like they were up at the top, and then everything fell. Everything was gone. And people devolved so much they became like ape people and fish people. They truly devolved. So you have to climb your way back up. It's like I don't know, I was going to say a dragon. That doesn't really make sense. Like a roller coaster, I guess, of humanity crashing, coming back up, crashing, coming back up. And there's something special about Conan being able to, I guess, function in either, because he's a political master, but he's also a savage, brute master. I don't mean like uneducated, but he can use his body to do anything. So he can hang with the barbarians, he can hang with the savage populations, but he can also topple a civilization, and he can call out civilizations that are corrupt. But it seems different from Tolkien because the gods create something, and then that thing expands, and then as evil corrupts it, the magic has to go away, and then modernity eventually comes. But it feels like there's progress, but also a loss of innocence that can never come back, and it needs to have that for the progress. Whereas Conan, I think in our modern age, according to Howard's writing, it could crash again, and we'll devolve again, become ape people, and then it will go back up again. What do you, did you, I guess, do you like one more? Did you notice, do you think that is important to know reading Conan?
Well, I'll start with, did I like one more? Because I think you're really right to connect this to Tolkien's kind of historical worldview, this idea. Really what he's writing is that there was a golden age, an Edenic age, or like an age where gods walked among men or something like that, though that wouldn't be strictly accurate for Tolkien's world. But you get what I'm saying, like, a kind of heavenly realm, which in Tolkien's world, it's always going down. It's always devolving. It's always sliding into disarray. By the time the Lord of the Rings, or by the time, the trilogy comes out, so much of that book is describing things that were once roads, but are now overgrown by trees, or are ruins of formerly great castles. You know what I mean? Like, you're really in the dissolution age in Tolkien, and it's all just a descent. What I love about this is the sliding scale of civilization. And I'm not sure that I've really read a genre fiction writer who has such a really well-developed, is it right to say well-developed? Maybe I'll say like, just like this particular view of history and fleshed out in this particular way. The fact that he's writing this stuff while he's a soda jerk, while he's mixing phosphates together, in
his 20s.
In his 20s, I think it's fantastic. But it's also like really cynical, if that makes sense. Like you imagine him pulling the cherry Pepsis to a bunch of flapper kids in the late 1930s, and just thinking you're all a bunch of apes. We're just one cataclysm, one earthquake, one meteor away from you all devolving back into ape people. It's just edgy enough. You feel the edge coming through, and I love that.
It's very edgy. I think he's extremely edgy. There's corpses, heads being lopped off. There's something really interesting about the both of them, and I wonder if it is essential to fantasy, and it is essential maybe to like these powerhouses that we've identified, or that everyone has identified, Howard and Tolkien, because they both hate industrialization, or at least there's something going on in their lives that ruins that Eden, ruins what they thought was the right way to live. I think it's called The Scouring of the Shire, the very last chapter of Return of the King, where the hobbits show everything is fixed now, except the hobbits show back up to the Shire, and now the tree has been cut down, the river's polluted, everything's they've got the mill turning and putting bad oil into the grass, into the river. I think not Conan, Howard is interested in the same thing because he was growing up in the oil boom of Texas, and he was in different towns. They would move from town to town to town to town to try and catch up with the oil boom. But he was in one town, I think called Ranger, Texas, where that's probably not what it was called. That's Walker, Texas Ranger. Anyway, he was in one town that went in like in 2 years from 1,000 people to 25,000 people. Wow. Yeah. And he writes this letter to Lovecraft. He says, I've seen whole towns debauched by an oil boom, and boys and girls go to the devil wholesale. I've seen promising youths turn from respectable citizens to dope fiends, drunkards, gamblers, and gangsters in a matter of months. So he sees something that he just hates. And he had, I guess, Texas before the oil boom is truly the Texas from all the Westerns that we've read, where there's just nothing except a little town, and people trying to get, it's not even like a town. It's just a few houses really far away. And now they just explode. And he says the violence that was just pervasive throughout his town, he couldn't escape it. All of his friends, like he said at the Soda Jerk, he probably saw lots of friends get hurt, get stabbed, get shot. There was shootings every day. So I think there's something interesting about these fantasy guys who want to fight against that. There's something about industrialization and the change of their towns that they really hate.
But it's not that he wants to fight against it in the sense of he doesn't, or that he wants like a peaceful world. I don't get the sense that that's the case at all. Like, because if he was like, I guess it's a question of what does Howard want? You know what I mean? It doesn't, I can agree with you that he doesn't seem to like the modern, civilized, mannered life very much. Actually, I'm going to pull in a quote from a story we're going to talk about later, but I feel like it aligns with my point. He says, civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skulls split. So there's a sense in which, from just that quote and what you're telling me, if it is modern life that Howard is so disgusted by, and I feel like disgust is really the right word, it's not that he wants to go to a time before when people fought each other in the street over oil money or whatever, but a time, I guess, when the innate aggression of people was just a bit more naked, I guess you could say, less hidden behind words. I mean, in this quote I read, he's talking about how all civilization does is allow you to be rude to people without getting killed. And it's like, I don't know. This is, as we read Howard, this to me is the question. What does Howard want?
I agree. I think so. Tolkien, wants to go back to the Eden, clean up the Shire.
Yeah.
Plant the seeds, let the tree grow. I think Howard just wants to, just like Conan, show up, kick some ass, change everything, destabilize everything. Because Conan comes in and he becomes king. He doesn't really want to be king, in the Phoenix on the Sword, the first story that we read, but he has to. But it seems like anytime he shows up somewhere, circumstances have to be flipped on their head. And I think Howard doesn't have a clear vision of where he wants to go, but he wants to be that power or that chaotic influence that at least can resist the bad change or the change that thinks it's good. So there's no clear vision, but he has to at least be the anti-vision.
Something that I want to keep track of, which is really only prefigured in this story, but the only two real characters we get in this are Eris and Gorm. And Eris, the kind of priestly figure, Gorm, the warlord. And I see this dichotomy a lot in Howard's stories. Like Conan, the warlord, or all of his warlord buddies, the different princes and rival kings. And then these wizards or these priests, I've yet to encounter, this could change, but I've yet to encounter a wizard or a priest in a Robert E. Howard story that was uniformly good. There's ones that are temporary allies, but never one that you trust. I don't know. I get the sense that maybe whatever priests and wizards and, or other highly, educated, cultured, art, mystic people represent for Howard, he kind of views it as the antithesis of some kind of pure, I guess we'll say spirit, as Conan is. I don't know. Have you picked up on this at all? Do you? Yeah.
So sword versus sorcery, maybe we should call it. I think let's look closely at Peleus when we get to, I think that's his name, Peleus from the Scarlet Citadel, and see what we think about him. The whole story, we'll find soon, is all about bad sorcerers. Maybe a good sorcerer too. But yeah, there is something about power outside of your own might, I guess. Your own honest hard work. Getting in there, doing the dirty work, getting your hands dirty, chopping off some heads. That's the right thing to do. But if you use a little bit of magic, maybe that's not quite right.
I guess the last thing I really want to talk about in this is Howard really wants the reader to know that even though this is a fictional world, it's still not quite a fictional world. And he does this by tying in the kind of fictional peoples that populate his universe with, ethnic groups, peoples, races, whatever that exist today. I guess like a couple examples would be, he says the Sumerians are Proto-Celts, Gaelics, Scots. The Nemedians are Proto-Irish. The Picts are Proto-Indigenous Britons and early Europeans. There's a ton of these. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about him connecting a fictional thing to the real thing to kind of place it in our world?
That's really important to talk about. We should have talked about that. Good thinking, Zach. The distinction between low fantasy and high fantasy and then epic fantasy. And of course, sword and sorcery, I guess it could straddle the line between high fantasy and low fantasy. But lots of people say that Conan is low fantasy because of this, because that Hyborian age eventually turns into the modern age. So there's really no universal or plain distinction between those two. One blends into the other.
Real quick, Bob.
Yeah.
Could you give me a one sentence overview of the difference between low fantasy and high fantasy, kind of as we understand it right now, before we continue?
Sure. Yeah, sorry. So I think low fantasy and high fantasy, lots of people say that one's better than the other. So it's low and one's high, so highbrow and low. But that is not at all the case. High fantasy is kind of hermetic. It's its own world. So Tolkien is high fantasy, arguably, because I think that's also supposed to turn into our real world. But Westeros is also high fantasy, Martin, because it's outside of our existence. And magic just exists, and there's no reason to question it, really. It's there. Low fantasy, then, like Harry Potter or the magicians, I guess, Lev Grossman, you have magic in our world. Harry Potter, they go to King's Cross Station, and then they go through platform 9 3/4. Lev Grossman, you are in regular London, and then you go into kind of a new school, just like Harry Potter. So this straddles the two because it kind of is hermetic in its own world. It doesn't really have a connection to us, except for all of this history that is in the peoples. So like you said, the Hyrcanians, the Nemedians become the Irish, the Aesir become the Norsemen. So in that way, it's low fantasy because it's directly connected to our world.
But I think it's functionally high fantasy in the sense that, like, the fact that
That's what I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that he connects it to our world and our time doesn't actually change anything about the characterization of anyone, nor the way the world itself works. It's a world of magic, and as we will see, aliens, and kind of elder mystic gods, Lovecraftian entities. So, I think this is a case of high fantasy using, a kind of like low fantasy flourish, a low fantasy detail to kind of add richness to it.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we could arguably say that is for Lord of the Rings too. No one ever talks about that, but it is supposed to be after Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I for one am glad we read this, despite it being kind of like a weird thing. We're supposed to be reading fantasy novels and short stories. I think that this is the case of like eating your vitamins. You read the essay and you're bigger and stronger for doing it. So let's carry on. I think we got a few more Howard stories to read. So I'll talk to you later, Bob.
One step closer to being big and strong like Conan. Talk to you later, Zach.